My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in a radical change from last week when I got all controversial about George R.R. Martin, I'm going back to something more of a standard type of video, which is kind of a deep analysis, and it's one which I teased in a video 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, where I mentioned the fact that you could do a video on the idea of how decisions are made in the Lord of the Rings and the effects that those decisions have over time. Because one thing that I noticed a while back is that practical decision making doesn't seem to happen a whole lot, actually. The interesting thing is, most of the practical details of the quest kind of get handled as a result of making moral decisions rather than prudential or practical decisions. And I decided to take a look into that, and sure enough, I found that my theory was pretty much substantiated by the actual record. So I'm going to take a look at a lot of the big decisions that get made in The Lord of the Rings. Not all of them, that's almost impossible. But, some of the bigger decisions that get made and really examine, is this a decision that's being made for a practical purpose, like deciding something on the level of a just, how do we get this done in a practical way? Or is it a decision that is made as this is the right thing to do? And then we're going to see how that impacts things one way or the other. So let's get started. Now, before The Lord of the Rings, we do have one major decision which kind of gives us a template for how this works, although it doesn't get framed that way until The Lord of the Rings. Because as Gandalf tells Frodo in his study in Bag End, after Bilbo's party and after he's discovered a bunch of stuff about the ring, he says the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many. And he's giving us this exact kind of idea by saying what Bilbo did out of a moral type of reasoning rather than a practical type of reasoning, because his practical reason told him, kill Gollum, you'll get out safely. He decided not to do that for reasons that were completely non-practical, and Gandalf is saying, because he made that decision, things will be very different in the long term, and we don't know how that's going to play out, but he also tells Frodo in the same context, be assured that because he began his ownership of the ring in that way, that he took less harm from it, which in and of itself is a good thing. And of course, we know as readers of the book that at the end of the story, it is precisely Gollum's survival that makes possible the destruction of the ring in the end. So these practical details can sometimes be handled by Providence despite the characters making decisions that seem to cut counter to that. Now we're going to look at decisions that are actually made in The Lord of the Rings and see if they hold up to this kind of paradigm. One of the first major decisions that has anything to do with the quest is Frodo deciding to leave the Shire. Now, in the movie, of course, this is all kind of done by Gandalf. He kind of decides for Frodo what he needs to do. And this is partially because the movie does not have time to do it the way that the book does. The book, Gandalf gives Frodo a huge exposition dump, and it's a great exposition dump because it's literally a necessary exposition dump from Frodo's point of view. It's not like the story is just giving us a huge bad exposition dump. It's well done in the story. But the point is, this all happens in the book in a way that is, long and drawn out, and then Frodo has to come up with this idea on his own, and part of the idea behind that is Gandalf doesn't want to force him for the same reason that he's saying you shouldn't force anybody to do anything with the ring, and he straight up tells Frodo, I couldn't make you do anything, because even if I tried, it would just break your will. So he's, already kind of also setting up the same paradigm. It's like, trying to force people to do things is bad, so I'm going to let you make the decision, and he slowly gets there, and eventually he decides, I'm going to leave the Shire. That way the danger will no longer be here, and the people that I love and the places that I love will not be in danger. And then, well, I can figure it out from there. I mean, he literally doesn't have a specific plan. And then Gandalf suggests, well, you could head to Rivendell. And I think Frodo mentions that before, but he doesn't have a definite idea of where to go other than he has a vague idea of following Bilbo and hopefully meeting up with him. He doesn't know where Bilbo is. He doesn't know he's in Rivendell. So, I mean, there's really no practical element to this decision. It is entirely a moral one of somebody's got to go, do something with this ring. Gandalf won't take it. I can't just throw it away and we can't destroy it. These are ideas that he tried to throw out. Like, let's figure out a way to solve this really easily, right? He's like, Gandalf, can you take it? No. Can we destroy it? No, actually you can't. These are all things that he tries to come up with, but at the end of the day, the decision he makes is kind of made for him in a sense, but he has to have the courage and the moral courage to actually do it. And that, of course, ends up having massive effects down the road because it means he ends up being the one to be the ring bearer, which leads to the success of the quest. Skipping ahead a bit, we get to the point where Aragorn is leading the hobbits from Bree to Rivendell. And there's been decisions, in between there, but many of them were fairly minor. You do have decisions like, how they are going to leave Crickhollow and not be noticed. And they end up taking the Old Forest, which, there's really only so many ways you can leave Crickhollow without being noticed. So it's not like there's much of a practical choice there, but it is one of the more practical choices in the story, but it's hardly one of the bigger choices, although it does lead to some, rather interesting adventures along the way. But this is one of those areas where we really do get more directly practical decision making, because when Aragorn is leading them through the wilderness, he is constantly having to make decisions of, how do I get these hobbits to Rivendell alive and avoid the Nazgul that are chasing them? And he, has to come up with ideas on, okay, which direction do we take? How long do we stay in the wilderness? How long do we stay off the road? This kind of stuff. There's a lot of that going on. How do we approach Weathertop? Well, let's go, head to the north of Weathertop and then come down to it through these pathways that are kind of hidden. And then, after Weathertop, it's like, well, how do we, get anywhere from here? We have to, keep moving. And one of the practical decisions that gets made, which is also sort of not a practical decision, is not letting Frodo rest. It's like, we can't just sit around, Sam. He's going to end up becoming a wraith if we take this too slow and easy. And Glorfindel confirms that. So that's a decision that's less practical, but still has a very practical element to it. But much of the decision making in this span of time is Aragorn literally like knowing the lay of the land and how to do, what he wants to do, although he does get lost at least once. So the practical decision making doesn't always pan out perfectly, although in the end, of course, they do make it where they want to go, and that's the main thing. But it does have its drawbacks, because Aragorn, even though he knows the country well and he ought to, be able to lead them well, it's like you can't know every inch of wilderness, even if you're 87 years old and you've been wandering around all that time. He ends up, going off and trying to get far enough away that the Nazgul won't find them, and then realizes, oops, I've come too far out of the way, and now we're kind of far, and we don't have a lot of food, and, it gets a little dicey. So it, almost ends badly, trying to do just the purely practical decision-making route, although it's really questionable what else they could have done. But this is one of the counter examples, so I wanted to bring it up. It's a good counter example because there's a lot of it in that span. Then, of course, once they're in Rivendell, you have the next major decision being, what do we do with the ring? And again, we have a lot of ideas thrown around, kind of like Frodo tries ideas at Bag End. He's like, well, how about we just melt it down or destroy it? It's like you couldn't even begin to scratch it. How about you take it, Gandalf? You're cool. You're wise and powerful. No, that would be too dangerous. We get a similar thing in the Council of Elrond, because what happens is you have different people throwing out different ideas of, well, why don't we use it as a weapon? Nope, can't do that, Boromir. We got, I think it's Erestor, or maybe it's Galdor. I forget which elf, but somebody makes the suggestion of, we could take it west or something, and it's like, Elrond's like, no, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't take it. This is our problem in Middle-earth. We have to solve it. And, then you've got the idea thrown out of, how about we give it to Tom Bombadil? He seems to have power even over the Black Riders. And again, I was like, it would slip his mind. He'd just throw the thing away eventually. All these ideas are thrown out and they're shot down as being, yes, impractical, but not exactly impractical so much as that just does not work. It's like, it's not just a bad idea, it is an idea that goes nowhere. It just doesn't have legs at all. And what Gandalf ends up saying, and Elrond, kind of helps him along with, showing this, is what we have to do is take the thing to Mount Doom and chuck it in, because it's the only place that it can be destroyed. And this is cast not purely in the practical sense of this is the only workable solution. In fact, it's cast as it seems like an impossible solution and therefore not very practical. But Gandalf makes the point, if we do something, we need to do it not just for, a few generations or something like that. We need to find a final end to this mess. We can't just push it off. We can't just try to find an easy solution. That is not what we're here to do. We have to find a final, way of dealing with this problem that'll take care of it forever so that nobody else has to worry about this. And this is made kind of in the response to the idea of, why don't we just chuck it into the ocean like Saruman apparently fooled everybody into thinking was actually the case, and that way it'll be out of the reach of Sauron. It's like, well, that's a neat idea in some way, but they have a history in Middle-earth of having land come out of the, ocean and also sinking into the ocean, and also if you don't destroy it and render Sauron impotent, he's just going to keep getting stronger and eventually conquer Middle-earth anyway. So, bad, also impractical. But the cast of the decision is very much one of a moral nature. It's like, we have to do the right thing by not only our time, but also future times that will also suffer if we don't do the right thing. And therefore, we have to choose this path, which seems completely stupid, because it's really the only way. And therefore, it may seem like it's impossible, but we must choose it anyway, because all other choices are bad in some way that is not merely impractical, but also doesn't actually take care of the problem, which is what they are really there to do. So there's definitely a moral component to this decision, which kind of overrides all other practical concerns, because if they were just looking at the practical concerns, they'd look at it and say, that's not happening, that's impossible, there's no way to do it, therefore why bother trying? Well, you still have to try, because it is the only legitimate way of solving the issue, so that's why. So again, we see the same kind of paradigm of, we have to make the hard decision, which seems highly impractical because it is the right thing to do. Now we end up with another major decision, which kind of is a weird one because it doesn't fit neatly into either category, seemingly. Because what happens is we get to this point in the story where Aragorn and Gandalf have very different ideas of how they should get east of the Misty Mountains. Aragorn wants to go over the pass of Caradhras. Gandalf wants to go under the mountain through, the mines of Moria. And they argue about it mostly in practical terms. But interestingly enough, the decision really ends up being taken out of their hands because there's, they end up trying to go over and it doesn't work. They get snowed out so badly that they have to go back down. Other ideas are thrown around, like, why don't we just go south and go through the Gap of Rohan? No, too close to Isengard. Bad idea. That risks, getting the ring captured by Saruman. Why don't we just go way south and then take the coastline route over to Minas Tirith? Takes too long. It's still dangerous because the roads are going to be watched, all this other stuff. And they're still debating the whole thing when they start hearing wolf cries, and the decision is basically made for them. It's like, we definitely are not going to end up running, hightailing it all the way down to the southern coast of Gondor with wargs on our tail the whole way. That's just not not a healthy way to make a decision. So it's like, and Gandalf points this out, who now will, choose to go that way with wolves on their tail. We're going to the Mines of Moria, people. There's really no two ways about it. So even though there was a practical debate on which is the best way to solve the problem, the decision is taken out of their hands. And this is, again, one of those areas where you kind of look at it and you realize Providence may have a hand in it, because what Gandalf says is, I thought all along we might have to take this route. And he doesn't say, I thought all along this would be the best or the safest or the quickest route. He said he thought all along they would have to go that way, which is really interesting, because it seems like he has a bit of a antenna for Providence here. And given that their goal is to reach Mordor, which is on the other side of the Misty Mountains, there's only so many roads you can take. And now that they've reached a certain point and they're committed to, that path, they're not going back. That would be, that would be to admit defeat, as Gandalf says. Their path gets decided for them by Providence or by something else, but certainly not by their own practical decision making, which is interesting. Although it's not made per se by making a moral choice, other than the moral choice to not return to Rivendell, at which point, as Gandalf says, they would not have another opportunity to set out again. So, only because they have made that prior moral choice is this really kind of dictated in that way, but they certainly don't really end up having any practical input into the matter. After crossing the Misty Mountains, we end up in Lothlorien, and Aragorn, who is now the not-so-happy leader of the Fellowship, wishing Gandalf was still around, has to decide how to lead the Fellowship from there. And one of the things that he's worried about is, do I go to Minas Tirith like I feel like I've been called to, or do I help Frodo out and go to Mordor? And he's wrestling with this decision, and he really doesn't want to have to make it, and he puts it off as long as possible, and they end up at the Falls of Rauros. Now, as it happens, the decision kind of ends up being made for him in some ways, and this gets connected and turned into a separate decision, sort of who to go after the breaking of the Fellowship. Because what happens is Frodo takes the decision of, who's going to go with Frodo out of his hands. It's not impossible that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli could follow Frodo and Sam once they kind of have figured out that that's where they went on their own. They just went across the river to go east by themselves. They could still follow them, but at the end of the day, Frodo kind of made the decision, I'm going off alone. I am leaving the rest of the company, specifically for the reason of it's going to destroy them all like it seems to be destroying Boromir, and I can't, have that on my conscience. So Frodo makes this decision on his own, on basically moral grounds. He knows he has to get the ring to the fire, and he realizes that if he stays in the company long enough, it's going to corrupt people too much, and Boromir has already reached the point where he's too corrupted. Therefore, he's got to just go. And it's Boromir's actions in trying to convince him, and then even trying to just physically take the ring, that finally push him over the edge to make that decision. So in one sense, there's a practical element to it, but it is still very much based in the idea of, this is the right thing to do. I have to get this corrupting influence away from the other members of the company so that it doesn't just destroy us all. And that kind of determines his practical choice of where do I go and how and with whom. I mean, he ends up taking Sam because Sam just catches up with him and doesn't let him go alone. But, the idea there is still the same. He's not going to take the rest of the company with him. So Aragorn's decision, which was a very kind of practical one, if he had just been allowed to make it, he basically said, I would, appoint 3 companions, Sam, Gimli, and myself. Well, he didn't get a chance to actually make that decision. It was taken out of his hands because Frodo made a different decision based on his own moral appreciation of the situation. And so Aragorn is now really only left with, do I follow Frodo and help him out, or do I go follow Merry and Pippin? And he makes the decision, and he doesn't explain the rationale of his decision here, but it seems pretty obvious that it's a moral decision rather than a practical one. It's like, for one thing, he says, my heart speaks clearly at last. that's not the kind of thing that you usually say in The Lord of the Rings or anywhere else when you're saying, I've come up with the best solution in my brain. That's not what he's saying. He's like, I know what I have to do. I know what the right thing to do is. And the right thing to do is to rescue Merry and Pippin because, Frodo has decided to go off on his own. We could help him, but, he's made this decision. He's taken that decision out of my hands. And we do have these two other members of our fellowship who have been captured and may well be tortured or killed or who knows what. If we can rescue them, we should. So even though he doesn't explicitly say any of this stuff, it seems pretty clear that his decision to follow Merry and Pippin is much more of a moral decision than a practical one. Because they don't have a whole lot of practical hope of catching the Uruk-hai either, because they get a huge head start. And, not only do they get a head start just because they get going before he finds Boromir, they spend a lot of time on Boromir's funeral. They have to gather a bunch of stuff up, put it in a boat, put Boromir in a boat, drag him all the way to the river, which is, he's a big guy and he's not lightweight. So, it takes him a lot of time to do all this. And so by that time, the Uruk-hai have a huge lead on them. It's like, what are the odds of them catching him? They don't know at that point that the Uruk-hai really don't have a problem with sunlight and can basically go forever like machines. But even so, they have a long road ahead of them to catch him, and there's only 3 of them versus we don't even know how many orcs, but we know that Boromir killed a bunch of them, and there were still enough to get rid of him. So the odds of them being able to actually succeed here are pretty slim. But they decide that, or Aragorn decides, we're going to do that anyway because it's the right thing to do. We owe that to Merry and Pippin. So there's these 2 decisions that kind of become, one morphs into the other sort of, but they're both made. Frodo makes one of them for Aragorn on moral grounds, and then Aragorn chooses to kind of go with Frodo's decision, again, based on moral grounds. And the implications of this decision are huge because it ends up being that, as a result, Frodo ends up meeting up with Gollum, who gets him into Mordor, and I'll get to that more in a minute. And Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli end up in Rohan as opposed to just going straight to Minas Tirith. And as a result, they end up helping Rohan, kick, Saruman's keister all over the place on, at Helm's Deep. And then the Ents, because of Merry and Pippin's intervention, at least possibly a little bit, also end up, wrecking Isengard. So as a result of all these decisions, you end up with a very different kind of story than you would have if they had just gone straight to Minas Tirith or if he had tried to follow Frodo based on practical decisions. So big, huge implications here, even though it's a decision that is kind of made for him, not in the sense of he couldn't have decided differently, but his decision was made by the moral choice, and therefore he felt like he was kind of being pushed in one direction by the right thing to do. Alright, so I mentioned Gollum, and of course we're going to touch on that. Frodo, like Bilbo, has pity on Gollum and ends up, treating him in a way that you would think was absolutely stupid if you were purely thinking about it from a practical standpoint. As a result, of course, Gollum ends up showing him the way through the Dead Marshes and to the Black Gate, and then tells him, by the way, there's a better way in than that. And it's not like Gollum is actually trying to be helpful here. He is trying to get the ring back. You have to realize, if you've only seen the movie, he does not really have a full-blown change of heart in the book. He certainly makes it look like it, but he is always plotting and scheming, although he does wrestle with the idea. He does have kind of that not exactly schizophrenic thing like we see in the movies where he's literally going back and forth like he's got 2 personalities, but he does argue back and forth with himself in a similar fashion in the book about how to go about what he wants to do. And it's not quite the same, but it is similar. But the point being, Gollum is kind of always scheming to get the ring in the book. He never completely goes back and then gets flipped over again by being ill-treated by Faramir and his men. No, he's always planning to get the ring back one way or the other. He just has 2 different ideas of how he wants to go about it. but it's Frodo's pity on Gollum that leads ultimately to the fact that Gollum gets him to Mordor and actually gets him inside, because otherwise Frodo and Sam really had no shot of doing that on their own, probably. I mean, how in the world were they going to do it? Were they just going to... I mean, for one thing, they got lost in the Emyn Wheel. They couldn't even get out of all of those mountains. And so it's like, okay, we're stuck here forever? Like, they might have eventually made it out. And then how would they go through the marshes? They wouldn't. They'd have to go around, take forever. And then how would they get into Mordor? They wouldn't even begin to know how, except figure out some way to get in the Black Gate. I mean, like, how would you even begin to figure that out? It's guarded ceaselessly by, eyes all the time. So, it's the moral decision to copy Bilbo in not just killing Gollum outright or doing something that would result in his death, like tying him up and leaving him, as Sam suggests. They end up taking him along with him, and he ends up showing them into Mordor. And without that, the quest could not have succeeded. So, huge moral decision, which has ultimately outcome-changing effects on the entire quest. Now we come to a couple of other decisions, which I have talked about before, because I have talked about how laws get broken a lot in The Lord of the Rings. And this is kind of the parallel decisions of Eomer and Faramir. Faramir has to decide what to do with Frodo and Sam. Eomer has to decide what to do with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Both of them go against what is strictly legally required of them. Faramir says, by law, what I really should do is bring you to the steward, and then you can hash it out there, and he can decide what to do with you. Eomer says, no strangers are allowed in Rohan. I should take you to Theoden, and he should decide what to do with you there. Both instead recognize that what's going on is kind of bigger than them, and therefore they decide, I'm going to do the right thing rather than the legally required thing and let you go, and, I will even help you on your way. Eomer gives Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli a couple horses. Faramir gives Frodo and Sam walking sticks and food, and he doesn't kill Gollum even though he reads murder in his eyes. So even there, he's kind of doing what Frodo has already done, which is to have pity on Gollum for Frodo's sake. So there's a lot of stuff going on in both of these decisions, but both of them are ultimately deciding what to do, not based on practical considerations, like here's what I am required to do legally, or even here's what I think would be the best thing to do, because, neither of them are making decisions based on, practically speaking, I think this is going to have the best chance of success in terms of being good for my country or whatever. Neither of them are doing that. Eomer knows he's going to get in trouble for what he did, and Faramir knows he might well get in trouble too, and also that he's letting the ring go into Mordor in the hands of two halflings and a Gollum, whatever he is. So, the practical considerations are definitely not at the top of the reasons for making their respective decisions. But, of course, they have big effects down the road. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli end up meeting up with Gandalf, not being chucked into a jail or something after going to Edoras. And, of course, Frodo and Sam are allowed to continue on their quest to Mordor, which, same thing with the decision with Gollum. Quest doesn't succeed absent that. If they had been taken to Denethor, well, we know where that would have ended up. There are a whole bunch more decisions, and these I want to go through kind of rapid fire because there's not as much meat to them, but there are big decisions. So one of them is Theoden's decision to fight, against Saruman. His decision here is really based on, I've got to defend my people, and I've got to, take care of this problem that's on my border. There's a certain amount of practicality to it, obviously. They are planning to meet up with the force that's already defending the fords of Isen. That ends up being kind of taken out of their hands because that force has already been defeated and scattered, and they end up therefore retreating into Helm's Deep so that they can withstand a siege because they're going up against a force that's way too big for them to fight with just what they brought on their own. And so, practically the decisions that they were trying to make get taken out of their hands. This is kind of like the Caradhras versus Moria thing. It's like they know what they're going to do, but then the practical decision of how to do it really gets decided for them. And then you have also Aragorn taking the paths of the dead. This is based not so much on a moral choice as it is based on fulfilling prophecy. And there is also a very strong practical element to it because he looked into the Palantir and he saw, what was going on with the Corsairs of Umbar down on the southern coast of Gondor. And he's like, well, there's only one way to get there in time. But there's also an impractical element to it too, because the Paths of the Dead, nobody's ever come through it alive. But he knows he's got this prophecy on his side, and he knows he's the heir of Isildur, which gives him, the kind of cachet he needs to get through there, because he can actually offer the dead their repose, let's say. And so he chooses it on those grounds. So this is one of the more practical decisions, actually, and it has big effects, but there's weird other things playing into it, because it's not just, I see in the Palantir these things that are happening, and then practically I know what I need to do. There's also the prophecy in the back of it that the sons of Elrond remind him of, and, it's a weird one because there's a lot of things going into it all at once. So it's kind of a unique choice in the scheme of the Lord of the Rings. But I think it is really a lot more along the practical side, but it's also informed by other things that are not practical, but also not moral. Pippin, we end up finding out, is going to swear fealty to Denethor, and this decision in and of itself doesn't have huge wide-ranging consequences, except for the fact that he ends up being, as a result, very close to Denethor a lot, and is able to stop Faramir when he decides to stop obeying Denethor. And I've talked about this decision before in the same context as the Eomer and Faramir. The idea that he goes against what is, legally his duty or his obligation to Denethor. He breaks that and instead does the right thing in order to save Faramir. Very impractical type of decision in one sense, but it's also practical in another sense because he is trying to save Faramir's life with the only means he knows how. But he's doing that again for the moral reason of, you don't just kill people, man. It's a little bit of a mix, certainly, but it is also a decision which has pretty big consequences, but it is, his original decision to swear fealty to Denethor out of a, kind of like paying a debt for what Boromir did, is certainly not a practical decision, but it is what allows all that later stuff, and so it has big effects in that way. And then, of course, the final kind of big decision in the story is the decision to just march on Mordor with an army in order to distract Sauron from looking in his own realm, trying to find these spies that have come in there with their little elven, blade and their dwarf mithril coat, and who knows, what's all going on there. Sauron wants to figure out what that's all about because he knows there's something going on, but he has to turn his attention elsewhere because Aragorn is leading an army which is pitifully small, but nevertheless potentially dangerous if Aragorn has the ring, and Sauron is getting ready to trap that fly and take the sting, as Gandalf so aptly puts it at the last debate of the captains. So that decision is entirely almost a moral decision. It is certainly not practical, except in the sense that it is designed to practically give Frodo more opportunity to do what he needs to do, but it is impractical in the sense of, Frodo's probably already dead, and, there's probably no chance he makes it to Mount Doom anyway, and we're just going to get ourselves killed, and instead we could stay in Minas Tirith and just try to hold out as long as possible. Practically speaking, that seems like a lot smarter of an option, even though there is a practical element to what they're doing. So, again, we see this idea of the best thing to do is informed largely by, going all the way back to the Council of Elrond. Look how we've come full circle. This idea that this is our goal, that we have to accomplish, and so we have to pick the means to best accomplish that in the moment, whatever that is. And at this stage, at this late stage, it's like they're going back to that same decision that was made in the council. Our only hope is the destruction of the ring. And we have to hope that Frodo has still got it and that Sauron has not got it, and therefore Frodo could still finish the quest. That being the case, the only way to complete that is to make sure he has as best a chance as possible of getting across Mordor without being captured or detected, and therefore, well, we're going to have to distract Sauron. So, the moral decision of this is how we win ultimately, this is what we do with the ring ultimately, is still informing choices all the way down to the very end of the story. So that's how that happens. Now, there are other decisions that get made, of course. There are, Frodo's decision to have pity on Saruman, which doesn't pan out so well because Saruman basically refuses it. You've got stuff like that. But these are, I think, some of the biggest decisions in the books, and they have largely the effect of taking the practical details out of the hands of the characters. And it's really interesting to look at that because when you think about it, the message here basically is don't worry about figuring out the best way to do things. Choose the right thing to do, and that will pretty much either dictate the methods that you use, or Providence will take care of the details. That's really kind of the deal. That's, at the end of the day, most of the characters have their decisions, their practical decisions, made for them by their moral decisions. Well, we've got to destroy the ring. How do we do that? There's only one way. Like how we get there exactly is, there's some variety of ways that we could potentially do that, but not a whole lot of those choices end up being made by the characters themselves. Lots of choices that have practical elements to them are, yes, they may be practical, but the practicality of it is determined by the prior moral decision. And a lot of the times the practical details are taken care of in a way that is, clearly providential. Like Gollum finally being the one to destroy the ring by pure accident, on his part, of course, and that being a result of not one, but two hobbits having pity on him. So there's this real big scheme that seems to be at play here where all the decisions that are of significance, of really major significance, mostly seem to be moral decisions. It's like if you do the right thing, the rest will work itself out one way or the other. And the corollary message is don't choose your means based on what practically looks good, just so, and then that kind of determines your ends. Because that's kind of the Boromir approach, right? The Boromir approach is, well, practically speaking, it looks better to just take the ring and use it as a weapon, but that kind of determines the end, because he's looking at it from the other way around, of course. He's like, the end is defeat Sauron, and the best way to do that is to use the ring as a weapon against him. But what he's really done, because of the nature of the ring, is said, well, the ring is a good way to defeat Sauron. The end of that is we become Sauron. Somebody else will be set up as a Dark Lord. It's like if you choose your means first, the ends end up being decided for you. Rather, let's choose the ends based on what is right, good, and true, and then the means will actually kind of take care of themselves. So there's two ways of making decisions, and the better way to do it is the one that works out for the characters in the story over and over again. Now, of course, this is not to say that Tolkien is preaching a message of if you do the right thing, everything will work out for you. That's not true. I mean, let's look at the facts here. Frodo did lose a finger and suffered immensely in a lot of ways. Boromir ended up dead. I mean, there's a lot of things that go wrong, and this is a story in which the good guys win, and not in real life. That doesn't always happen. That's unfortunately, we don't live in a fairy tale. At least not in small scale terms. If you agree with Tolkien that the greatest fairy tale, which is also true, is the Christian myth, then we do live in a fairy tale in that sense. But I'm talking about like in short scale terms. Like you'll have two countries go to war, and not necessarily the good guys are going to win. So the point being, I'm not saying that if you follow this advice, you will necessarily have good outcomes in your life. But again, from Tolkien's Christian point of view, the idea is if you do the right thing rather than just trying to pick your means to be the most efficient or the most practical or whatever, and then that kind of determines your ends, in the long haul, it is better to choose the way that Tolkien's characters choose. That's, the perspective from which this is coming. Because at the end of the day, from a Christian perspective, our hope is not in this world anyway, right? The hope is actually in a later time when everything gets set right. So you can see why Tolkien would make this such a big part of his story, because it's using that idea of, doing the right thing from a Christian point of view, because not necessarily because it's going to go right for you in this life, but because it will go right for you in the longest possible term. So you could see where he gets that, and it really does seem to inform the story, because all of these decisions kind of pan out the same way. We choose the right thing to do, and the details work out. Ultimately they work out. Does it work out nicely? No, not necessarily. But, in the apocalyptic sense of avoiding the worst possible outcome in the longest possible term, they all do work out. So I thought this was a really interesting look at how decisions get made, because when you really stop and look at it, there is a ton of decisions that get made, and very infrequently are they practical decisions, and very infrequently are the choices left to the protagonists practical in nature. And it was a thing that I kind of noticed, and I was like, I wonder if I look at this in more detail. Sure enough, it just seems to be true throughout. So let me know if, you think this analysis pretty much works, or if you think I've overlooked like all of the decisions that are counter arguments to this. Like I said, I certainly did not cover all the decisions in the story. That's pretty much impossible. I've already run way long on this video anyway. But it is certainly an interesting thing to look at no matter how you handle it. And I think it's worth discussing in more detail than I have time for here. So again, leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. Subscribe on whatever platform you're watching to catch my future content. And if you're on YouTube, make sure you click that bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can also join my Discord and find other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Marie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.